Hey there. So, I got a new camera and I hope you like the qualities. Kicking off a new series, like I said before, this is going to be Tailwind Button Components in this video, so I want you to check it out. And we're actually going to be using Tailwind JIT, so just-in-time compiler, to kind of kick off this project. I wanted to kind of have an excuse to actually, use that new feature of Tailwind, and my God, it's fast. So I'm super excited to get started, and I hope you are too. So I'll see you in the video. Okay, so I'm going to start from scratch and create this project along with you. We're going to use a new framework called Vite, and it's not necessarily a framework, but it's a way to kind of kick off and compile apps and stuff, and it's made by the guys at Vue.js. So I figured I saw a demo project of Tailwind JIT, and I wanted to kind of use it as an example. So this is kind of how they've done it, and I know part of this video isn't really about the button components of Tailwind CSS, but I want you to maybe just get the real day in the life of how I would approach, building an app or creating a new app and creating these components. So I'll kick things off to not be too long-winded. Let me go and, wow, we don't need caps locks. So yarn, we don't have to install anything to use Vite. So you can actually just say create Vite.js app. And I'm going to just call this Tailwind CSS Buttons, something like that. And we'll use a Vue.js template for now. You could use other things if you want, like React or whatever, but up to you. And we'll just run this, and it'll go out and fetch everything it needs, so you don't have to do anything like installing stuff on your own. I've done this once before, so it took almost no time. And we'll do cd into that project. Whoops, I cannot type. So Tailwind CSS Buttons. See if I could just complete. Yep. And then we need to do yarn to install our dependencies. You could also use npm if you want. You don't have to be stuck to yarn. I've used yarn for a while now, so it's like almost muscle memory. And then they say to do yarn dev, and that'll boot up a server, and I'll go ahead and let that roll. But you just get 3,000 localhosts, and it should boot up in whatever browser is your default. If you click that link in your, I'll use Firefox, but I'll open that, and we'll go to 3,000, assuming everything loads here. And there's the Vite app, so pretty cool. If you want to see the documentation, and check it out if you want to. It's kind of a new way to kind of do modern ES6 stuff and get out of the Webpack, atmosphere. Webpack is great. It's brought us a long way, but the speed and everything else has just been insane to try to compete with once your app grows. So that's kind of why Vite exists. And I think Evan Yu, the guy who created Vue itself, is the people, or at least he is behind this, I believe. I'm not 100%. I'm quite new to it, but even Tailwind sponsors them, just based on the things they're doing. So all that aside, we created our new app. So now we can go and check out, go to the code. This is what it looks like when you install a new app based on the Vue template. There's actual Vite config, which is essentially defining the Vue and just importing plugins and defining this config based on what you want to pass. There's a lot of options you could pass at this URL if you want to go check that out. For the sake of time, I won't be doing that. And then in our source file, our source directory is where we'll be working mostly. This is the main Vue app. If you've never used Vue, this might be a little confusing. If you have, this should be pretty straightforward. These are single file components, and within them you can render and generate HTML and custom components that essentially generate HTML and JavaScript and style sheets as you need to. So what I'll do is honestly kind of just scrap some of this stuff, but for now, what I want to do is at least get our project set up to what we need to use Tailwind JIT out of the box. So if you're not sure what the JIT part of what I keep saying is, it's more or less, it's short for just in time. And basically that just means the code compiles as you write it. instead of being compiled, you know, as you complete the full circle. So Webpack, every time you save, maybe for instance in a style sheet or something, and you make a change, it needs to recompile your entire project. And in this case, it's more or less just the thing you changed. So it's kind of a quick and dirty explanation. I'm sure there's some better explanations out there for it, but that's just the way I'm assuming I understand it. So with that added, we need to install Tailwind as a dependency because our current project has nothing to do with Tailwind at this point. If you look in the package.json, we've just got the basics. So Vite itself and the plugins we've passed. Since we passed that view template, we installed this plugin and then the view compiler to do the view basic stuff that you need. So with that in mind, what I want to install, of course, is Tailwind in this case. So we'll say yarn. I keep hitting caps locks. There we go, yarn, add, and I'll do @Tailwind CSS / JIT, which is their newly released thing. I'll also install Tailwind itself, so we'll just say Tailwind CSS @latest, and PostCSS, because that is a dependency of Tailwind, latest, and auto prefixer, another dependency of Tailwind. Prefixer @latest. For all of these, I'm going to just save it as dev dependencies, which essentially means it's just that in our local development environment, we're going to make use of these things, and eventually in production, it will compile down to basic CSS and HTML in the end, and JavaScript, of course. So with that, I'll run this. It will go fetch those packages and append the new configuration to our package.json file. So you'll see those things appear here when you run that. And the key thing here is just to make sure you have Tailwind, PostCSS, auto prefixer, and if you want to use JIT, I'm going to use it. You don't have to, but I just wanted to honestly have an excuse to use it. So now we'll go ahead and use PostCSS and create a new config file for that. And that's usually at the root of your project. So I'll just say postcss.config.js. In that file, we just need a few lines. It's a kind of a module based thing. So module exports, and we'll create an object within that. We'll pass in this plugins object. And here we'll define that JIT library that we just installed. So Tailwind CSS, and then you just pass JIT and just an empty object there. We need a colon here, and we need auto prefixer as well. So auto prefixer. Tailwind CSS documentation has a lot about setting this up. So if this looks foreign to you, to check that stuff out. Okay, and then finally, since Tailwind is, you know, configured to be used now in PostCSS world, we need a Tailwind config itself as well. And a nifty thing you can do in the command line is generate that automatically. So I'll write npx tailwind init, and it'll just create a new config file for you at the root of your project, and it's called tailwind.config.js. And this is just a way you can actually customize your Tailwind installation. There's a way to extend the default theme and the variants and the plugins in this case. So with JIT, it's going to actually just write the theme, write the code that you use from Tailwind on the fly. So you're not getting all these classes predefined until you actually use them. So that's kind of a neat thing. And what's really cool, I'll show you in the future, is you can actually add custom CSS inline like you couldn't before with Tailwind. So I'll get into that. Since we have this theme configuration now, we actually need a way to import Tailwind CSS as CSS. And the best way I've seen and probably know is just create a new file called Tailwind CSS or some other maybe application.css file. And this is going to be essentially PostCSS, but it looks like CSS. So hopefully that's not too confusing. And the way we can add Tailwind is use these directives called @Tailwind. And you need to add base, components, and utilities. If we can spell utilities, there we go. And that's essentially going to give us what we need. But we need to pass that, since this is going to be JavaScript rendered or generated. It's like CSS and JavaScript. We need to actually import it into our main.js file now. So import basically that file. So we'll just say .tailwind CSS and save that down. And let's check to see if our server is working or not. If all looks good, we should be able to get some basic Tailwind stuff out of the box. So we can confirm that by doing a bit of changes to our main app here. So if we go and get rid of some of this stuff, I'll probably use a different component than hello world there and pass this down. Maybe I'll just have a container class. It's part of Tailwind. MX auto shifts it to the center. PX auto, PX6 just kind of gives it some offset from the horizontal, and PY is offset from the vertical aspect. And we could just say hello world for now. I'll get rid of these styles. I don't really plan on using those, and these comments. So this is going to be leveraging Vue.js 3, by the way. So some of this stuff looks foreign. If you're used to Vue 2, there's a different concept of importing components. You'd have to actually declare them in a components object. In this case, it's automatic, so it's pretty cool. We'll get into more of that in a second. For now, I'm just going to save this down and see if we get anything. Looks like it's not quite working, so I'll troubleshoot if we need to. Okay, what I'll do for now, and we'll troubleshoot this in a second, is to just create a new component. I'm going to call it Tailwind Buttons, just a global component. This could be whatever you want to call it, but we need to declare it and import it below. So I'll say import Tailwind Buttons from Tailwind, we'll say components, Tailwind Buttons, and we need to create that file. I'll do .vue just for explicitness, and there's already a hello world here. I'll go ahead and edit that to be Tailwind Buttons, and we'll remove this stuff for now. And this is just part of Vue 3. If you're not used to it, I'm still new to it, to be honest too, but most of this stuff is just more of the stateful stuff. We're not going to really be dealing with that since I'm just creating components in Tailwind. Vue is just giving us the toolbox to do things pretty quickly. So let's go and add another component here. We'll just start with, like, say, solid buttons, and it's just going to be its own component. And I'll do that. I'll import that below. Like I said, in Vue 3, you don't have to worry about actually explicitly declaring it, which is great. You just import it, and it's just taken care of. So we'll just say components. Going to be 2 dots here, and solid buttons .vue. You don't probably need to use .vue, but I'm going to. So I will do that and create that component. Finally, in that file, we'll have the actual start to our project. So I have snippets I think I can do here. Is it? Yeah, snippet. Do v-base 3. It's going to give you this stuff by default. I'll just kind of remove that for now. And all we really need in this file is the template, so it's kind of a nice thing. And with Vue 3, you don't actually need that parent div that they always require you to type. It's kind of a neat thing that snuck in there that took me by surprise. So I'm going to give these these sections like a heading, just so we can easily signify what's different about them. Text gray 900. Didn't mean to do that. There we go. And margin bottom 2. And this will just be solid style buttons. Let's see if we can get that to first render. Import, save this down. Yeah, so we got something there. Some of the styles don't appear to be working though. I'm going to double check we've got everything right here. Tailwind config. Vite config. Oh, I know what I did wrong, I think. No, that's right. Oh, you know why? It's purging stuff, so we need to not let it purge our stuff here. So we need to do all of our Vue files dot view, so star dot view. And the same with our build. So once we build or in our public directory, we're going to have some Tailwind stuff that's output there. This is kind of just important to have. So we'll say star.html. I think this should take care of that then. Yeah, there we go. So our purge configuration was actually messing things up. So now stuff's actually rendering because it was removing all our classes from before. So if you're not sure what that little extension does, it goes through your HTML, and if you're not using a class or it doesn't see it or you don't pass any files here, it doesn't know to strip the CSS out. The whole point is just to keep the file size small so you're not painting tons of CSS on a page load. Tailwind is huge, and if you don't do this, it's really going to wreck your website's performance or your app's performance. So you really want to make sure that's dialed in. For this app, it's so small it doesn't matter, but I'm just going by their guidance here. So now we've got our solid buttons component. We can start to kind of dive in and think about component-based Tailwind. And buttons are one of those things that are going to be repeatable no matter what. You really want to only kind of keep a few button variants in your app. I think too many will kind of start to make your branding not persist, and then things just be confusing because there's all these different styles and colors and sizes and whatnot. But you might think even what I have here is going to be a lot, which it kind of is in my opinion, but it's mostly just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to just add some, like I said, divider tracking. Just like to use this like a superscript subheading to give a little bit of hierarchy here. And this will just say small because we're going to have small buttons. So there, that's that offset. And then we could start creating buttons. And what I'll do is offset just by a bit, so 6 in this case for Tailwind. And then I'll just add buttons ad hoc. And you could go through and add all the styles in here just using typical Tailwind. And I actually recommend doing that first. When you're first creating the button, do that. And in fact, I will. I'll show you what I ended up doing. So a basic button in my case, I'll probably do some basic padding to the right and left of the button text, and then on the vertical axis as well. So the button has, of course, padding, maybe a slight shadow, so it's offset of the page. If you do have a hover effect, you need a transition property to kind of give it a real gradual effect as opposed to just like a straight from one color to the next if you're hovering over it or focusing on it. In doing that, I like to add a longer duration of 300, and we'll make the border radius rounded. Leading will be snug. Leading, if you're not sure, is the line height in CSS, so the height of the text as it's written in like paragraph form. And on buttons, I don't want this text to ever wrap, so I'll actually keep that from happening by saying white space, no wrap, which is part of Tailwind, of course. And we'll use the font size, that's the base font size. I think it's rated at 1 rem, and semi-bold for the font. So we'll just say, what is this, primary. Now we don't have any background color, so maybe I'll use just a background blue for now to start. BG blue 500, text white, and then hover we'll say BG just a darker blue, so 600. And you see how the classes just get huge. That string of text is massive, and if you're trying to go and reuse this throughout the app, you can see why you want to probably make a component out of this. So what I end up doing is first I'll write it like this, and that'll give me like the real basis of, okay, this is how it should look. This is what's looking good for me. It's kind of a bootstrap look in my opinion, but it's a little tall, but it's nice. I don't know. It's kind of big. Might make it a little smaller, but I think it's good and accessible and whatnot. So we'll keep it as is. And what I want to do is make this a component. And the way I want to do it is have probably a basic button class that has no opinions on color, but just dictates what the button will either, the cushioning around it, so the padding and the effects it has, as well as the line height and text size. So we'll start there, and then we will go and add color in a secondary class that you can append to the same button that essentially themes it, if you think of it that way. So what I like to do, and it's actually recommended you do add your own custom components after the components declaration here. So I'll add, the start of this will be a button, and with PostCSS you can use this @apply statement, which essentially can apply classes that you use in your HTML directly in the CSS, which is super powerful with Tailwind, because then you're not doing things that make other styles in your app way inconsistent, and that to me is huge. So what I want to actually do is remove these last three classes and append that to its own button class. So I'll say button primary in this case, and we'll do the same thing here. Oops. So at the time of this recording, I am on Tailwind CSS 2.0.4. As of Tailwind 2, I believe you can do these hover classes just like you see in the CSS. Prior to this, if you're on an older version, you'd need to actually do like a hover native HTML or native CSS hover declaration in your CSS and do the same stuff. That is no longer the case, and that to me is super cool. So you can get away with responsive styles here as well for Tailwind, which is something I think is huge. So now, right now our button's the same state. If we go back to that and remove these, I want to apply just the button class and then the button primary class. And while that's more semantic, more cleaner to look at, we bury that CSS away. It is the same stuff, so you don't have any difference in the appearance or anything. And it makes it just a little bit more, a lot more reusable in my case, because this is, for one, easier to remember, but two, it's just less to write. So that's one caveat with this. I think with Tailwind, sometimes this stuff, as you see it like right here, this just gets wild, So there's give and take, and I think that's its biggest criticism, as you see out in the wild. Okay, so why don't we do a few styles? I'll do a button secondary for instance. So secondary. A lot of times in apps or websites I build, I'll do up to 3 colors. So tertiary is my third. And these are actually the default size. Remember I wrote small here, so we can even go as far as adding a small class. So I'll say button small, or SM in this case, to do the magic here. So let's go back to this, and on button, you can make button kind of inherit the styles here, but then overwrite it by doing the dot notation just like this. And what I'll do is apply and just decrease the padding and text size. So px4, we got 5 up here, py2 here, and then text small will make the buttons dramatically smaller. So if I refresh, you notice that definitely decreased in size. And then since we have tertiary and secondary, so we need to add those to the mix. So instead of primary, I'll just do secondary and button tertiary. And what we'll do, you can use whatever colors you want here, but I'll do maybe indigo. BG indigo 500, hover will be BG indigo 600, and we'll do text white as well. Tertiary, let's do something more neutral, so maybe apply will be button or BG gray 600, we'll do text white as well, and hover BG gray 700. Okay, so that gets our theming in order. We should have our buttons all panned out right here. That looks pretty good. We need to, have some offset, of course. I would add that. You could add margin, I think, in the component, but that's pretty risky because there comes times where your button doesn't need margin, and I think those are the things I keep out of components because that's more opinionated. That's more relative to what and where the button is located. So I often will keep the component-based classes without any margin and just add that. Since Tailwind has its own margin capabilities, you can just add that as you need it. So I'll just do that. So now they're offset. Sweet. So we have small. Let's just do this. Should go pretty fast if we want base or default. I'll just do default. And we probably don't need this. We do probably need a divider, so maybe an HR. Well, you just use the this here. In fact, I'll do this for this one to keep it consistent. Okay. So now we got default, but of course we don't need button small here, so I'll just remove that, and we should end up with our default styles since the button class, BTN class, has those by default. And I just realized I didn't change the names here, so secondary, tertiary, and we'll follow suit. So secondary, tertiary. Okay, sweet. And finally, let's do large. So we've got CSS. We can just do button large. Very Bootstrap inspired. So apply again. And we'll double check our styles here. And I'll go with text large and px8, py4. So that'll make it pretty large. I'll duplicate this. And we'll give this large. And all we have to do here is change btn large. There we go. So that's our first solid set, and we can go as far as, making this component just continue and do different variants. But I think I'll add a second component that's like outline. So outline buttons. And instead of like importing them here, we'll just import it to the main Tailwind component. There's that. And then we'll say my16 just to give like some offset between them. We'll say outline buttons. And just import those all the same. So notice the setup here. You need that to do what we're doing here. So make sure that's there. If you're seeing bugs or don't understand why it won't work, that's probably why I ran into that. And Vue.js 3 is so new that my editor thinks this is broken, so we haven't used these variables yet. So it's something that it will think is off, but you can ignore that for now, I think. And now we can go into the outline buttons. I'll actually just add an offset below it for now. We're going to add more, but again, we just need the basic template here. I'll just use 3, but we'll just delete this stuff. We don't need it. And then in that one, we'll have button outlined, and I'll copy the H2 I started with here just to use it here. Again, we don't need the outer div in this case since we're using Vue 3 here, and we just say outline, and then we'll go to town. So margin bottom 6 again for a divider. And we'll start with small, just like we did solid. In fact, I'm going to copy this file, and you'll see what I'm going to do. I'm just going to paste this in, and in this case, we're just going to add button outline to each button. Big old time saver. I was command clicking to get those cursors, by the way. So now, all we need to really do is just adjust our components to be outline capable. So we've got our button primary. Now we just need to extend it to be outlined. So I'll just say the same and say button outline, which will inherit these styles, but then we'll modify them as we see fit. So in this case, I'll just say apply and go ahead and make the text blue in this case. So the text blue will be 500. We'll have a BG of transparent. Since we're trying to override these, this is going to be background blue if we don't put this. And then we'll say border blue 500, and hover, we'll say BG blue 500 or 600, and then hover text white. So we get like the fill on hover. So let's see like the inverse of the outline. So I'll show you what that looks like at this point. So primary is working. These two aren't because we don't have that set up yet, but that's essentially what we're after. So pretty sweet. And I just noticed that says solid here. So we'll say outline. Save that down. For whatever reason, it did not change. Save. There we go. Okay, cool. So let's do the same for the secondary. So button secondary, button outline. And essentially do this. I'm going to copy this down. And since we're using indigo and secondary, we're just going to change anything blue to indigo. I'll do Command D to find the blues and from top to bottom. So indigo, and we'll just change those out. Now that should be changed. Sweet. I'm going to close that for now. And finally tertiary, so we'll do the same. So tertiary, button tertiary, and then button outline. And we'll pass these same styles and do the same. So it's pretty straightforward. This just saves time. I think if you componentize things like this, it makes a lot of sense. Not always, but sometimes. So button gray, I think this one I actually want to up 100. So we'll say that. There we go. And that should do the trick. Awesome. So that's just a variant. It's nothing, extraordinary, but those are just different ways to do buttons there. And then what about if we did buttons with icons? We could do that. Yeah, let's do that real quick. So buttons with icons. View. And essentially, I'm just going to grab the same with solid, go over here and just say solid with icons. And what we'll need to do is essentially pass in a SVG is probably the best bet here. I'll just get a generic icon. I think maybe like a star or something. I don't know. We'll find something. So star. Maybe this guy. Kind of like this one more. And we'll add that. I'll make its own component just to keep it in its own space. So we'll say icon star view, and that'll give us a reason to use. I'll put a template here. Hang on, template, and we want to remove that fill because we'll be adding classes to make that ourselves with Tailwind. And same with that group. If you use Nucleo, it's like my biggest pet peeve, but it's all good. Nucleo is that icon app I just pulled up. It doesn't come with those icons that you saw me copy. Those are part of, I think, Hero Icons, which is by the guys at Tailwind as well. So you might check those out. So there we go. That's saved down. We have icon star. We'll need to import that as a dependency or a component, I should say, into this one. It's something we haven't done yet, and it's quite simple. If you just say script and come back down, my editor gives me ideas. I'm just going to leave it for now. It's going to autocomplete, but I don't actually need any of this. I'm just going to say setup here and then import that icon. So we'll say there. Now we've got that in our arsenal, and we could just import that as needed. So I'll go ahead and just put a, what do we want to do here? So for we'll start at the small. We've got primary. I'll put the icon first, so it'll be like on the left of the text. And we'll leave the text alone. hopefully. And then we can just pass in icon star. And then we can add classes to it to modify it. And this will essentially apply those classes to the SVG itself. So we'll set a width and a height. And since it's I think it's a stroke, we'll see. Stroke current and text white. Since we're on a colored background with the primary button, we want it actually to appear white. And we'll say inline block and margin right, just to give it some offset from the text. And let's see how that looks for now. We need to import it over on the main component though. So here, again, import it here. Now you totally don't need view at all to do any of this, so don't get me wrong. It just makes setting up Tailwind a lot easier, so that's why I use Vite, and I also just wanted to use Tailwind JIT to see how fast it was. I think I've said that before, but I'm just reiterating that if you're just coming and seeing this video. So there we go, icon buttons. Yeah, probably should have put button icons, but it's all good. And we'll do another divider. And go back to our browser. Here we go, solid with icons. So nothing's shown there. It is appearing. So I think it's actually a fill button is the problem. So I'll go back here. I'm going to kill these files, icon buttons, and we'll do fill current instead of stroke current. Let's see if that makes a difference. Let's go back to the SVG real quick. We will add class fill current. Wonder why that's not working. Okay. Use source real quick. Let's see what's up. Icons, because I can't spell for one. So let's go back to that. Icon buttons, it should be star. There we go. Cool. So let's make this smaller. That's pretty big. Nice. And if you want to make this like aligned a little better, probably the easiest trick is, let's remove that. And we'll go back to the button itself and just say inline flex and then item center. That should flex things to the center. There you go. Cool. And it's up to you if you want that offset to be a little bit more. You might add like margin right 2 here. Might be a little much though. But that works. I think that's better. So cool. Now it's essentially just a matter of if you want any effects on hover, you could do what's known as group class. So like a group class on the button, once that group class is on hover, you can add like say opacity to this. So opacity, I don't know, 75. So on hover, the icon actually gets, you know, lighter in opacity. You're not used to that. The group class is required on a parent item. And then once that item's hovered on or interacted with, you could do things on like group focus, group hover, whatever, directly in Tailwind, which is pretty sweet. So one cool thing I want to just point out real quick about the like margin or honestly anything in Tailwind JIT, if you add these brackets like this, and it's margin right still, right? Put like, I don't know, 120 pix. Watch. It goes right 120 freaking pixels. Like that's the cool part of the JIT that I really wanted to try out. Custom CSS inline. That's freaking money, if you ask me. You don't want to go and use that like crazy because you're adding even more CSS to Tailwind CSS, but holy shit, you know? Anyway, I'll revert that back because I don't have any need to do that for real. But if you're ever positioning something weirdly on a web page, oh my god, that's super powerful. So that's something to keep your eyes peeled for. JIT is actually coming very soon, I think, to the latest version. It'll just be a default that you can opt into. Okay, so I'm going to add it to the secondary class now. We'll just kind of follow suit here, and I'll add the group class here for sure. And that'll give us the same look. We need that inline flex item center class. There we go. It's the same look. This is repetitive, I know, but I'll just do it for the rest. So maybe if you want, you can skip ahead. So for the default size, I'd probably go back up to either 4 or 5 on the height. That's the only change I'll make. 4 looks pretty good, so I'll keep that one. Save that down. Inline flex, item center, group gives us those effects. Everything looks pretty good. Okay. One more for the default size. All right, there's that. And then finally, let's do the large size. I'll probably bump these up to width 5 and height 5. Let's get these formatting right real quick. Save that down. Again, like I said, 5, so just increasing the width and height. Save that down. I'll just go ahead and apply. I'm going to unsave that because my formatting, I didn't want to do that real quick. Apply this to these, and then just copy this. Should actually format it for me. Okay, and there we go. So now we've got things pretty square. Large looks kind of funky. I don't know if I'd even have an icon in that state, but that's up to you if you need it. But that's the idea. I'm not going to do the outline in this case because I don't think I mean, it's just a little bit variant, and you've already done outline here. Probably get the idea. So next I want to do a grouped base button, and just to show you by example, it's just going to be one button, one set of group buttons. So grouped button view, and we'll do the same old song and dance here. So just do 3 with the composition API. We don't need anything in here. Save that down. In our Tailwind component, we'll add a similar thing. So grouped buttons go, and that's going to look like so. Let's start with the main heading that we've been doing. So I'll just grab that here. Honestly, I'll just grab these 2 group buttons, have a closing div, and this one will be a little fancy because we want to have some buttons up aligned to each other. So I'm going to actually flex a container around the buttons themselves, and we'll say this might be a little more custom than our components, but we'll want the button class still. Let's just do 1, 2, 3. Cool. And for the first one, we want it. I basically want it to look like one set of buttons. So, you know, if you've ever seen like a toggle between, like, almost like, I'm trying to think what it would look like, but each has its own active state, and then they just interact like almost like a radio, like it. I don't know. If it's active, it's the one that looks active, and it's not, it's not. So we'll add border on the ones. We don't want border on the right on the first one. We do want border on the bottom and the top. And then we'll just give it a slight gray hover state. So that'll kind of set the stage to give it that like basic feel. And then the middle one is going to have its own custom borders. So we'll just probably give it a complete border, no roundedness, and hover of the same state. So BG gray 100. That gives it that state. So now we've got like a collection going on here. Finally, the third will be border top, border right, border bottom, border, and then rounded left will be none, yeah. And rounded right we definitely want. And then hover again, BG gray 100. So there you go. That's basically it. If you want to add an active state, you could totally do that. Maybe that might make sense for a component-based class, or you could just toggle some Tailwind-based classes as well. Up to you. But that's just essentially how I would do it. So pretty sweet. Okay, and finally I want to do a drop-down based button, which is kind of proprietary to, you know, the Bootstrap fame. So drop-down button. This one's got some JavaScript involved, so it's some basic Vue.js, so it's not a huge deal. But it does involve that, so let's get going. Drop-down buttons. And import those. I'll just copy that. There we go. And in that component, we'll do the template thing. I don't really need to even be doing this, but it's okay. We will export default here. And I do actually need to return some. I don't need a setup method in this case. I'll just inherit the typical old data one. And we'll just have a basic state of active or not. Close that. So this will be like saying, is the dropdown open or closed? So we'll just say false by default because we want it closed, of course. So let's create the actual dropdown. I will add first, real quick, I want to add the little heading I'm just stealing from another component. So go back to dropdowns, add this. And we'll add a button, go figure. And in it we'll just use the primary classes for now. So button primary. And I want to make sure this is flexed. So item center, it'll kind of push things center and justify between. So we're going to add a chevron to the right. So I'm going to have like a text that says just drop down. And I'll just grab the SVG. It's not a big deal that it's a component or not. Maybe in a big app it would make sense, but let's open Nucleo again and get the chevron. Again, this is hero icons I tend to look at, so solid here. And chevron down. This one will do. I'll just copy this straight SVG and we'll just embed it in the actual file here. It's not a huge amount of stuff, so I'm not too worried about it. It is, I mean, it could get pretty gnarly, but we'll leave it for now. So there's our SVG that's going to be just doing stuff as we actually interact. So I'll actually give it some base classes for now. It's going to have that width and height. And text white, fill current. That essentially fills it with the color of the button. So the text color of the button is going to be white thanks to this class. And the fill current will just inherit from that. That's kind of how that works for SVGs. So transform, and this is going to give us, when the dropdowns are open, I want this to kind of animate. So that's what's going on here. It's going to basically just toggle its rotation. So we'll actually bind that to a class with view. And when active is actually active, we'll rotate it. So we'll say, pass an object here, and we'll pass this Tailwind-based class, so rotate 180, and then you can pass active here, and it's essentially going to return true or false. If it's true, we'll go ahead and append this class to this element. If it's false, it'll remove it. So it's kind of just like saying classless add in JavaScript or classless remove, but way easier in this case. All right, so outside of the button is going to be the menu, I think. I don't need to have it in the button. I don't think that's very semantic. So this will only show if active is present or true. So if active, we can just pass that. And we'll give it some class. Oh, we need to do that. Classes, so we'll say list reset, and BG will be white, B border, PX or P4, just some border or some padding around the whole thing. Rounded bottom, large, just the bottom side will make it look like a drop down. Shadow will make a big one, so XL, and just give it a hard width for now. You might want to change this in the future if you're using this elsewhere. Given the nature of a hard width, you can't control it as much as you'd like. And then for each link, we're just going to have some styles. That's not going to go anywhere, but it's all right. So we'll say class will be px3, py2. Hover will be BG gray 100. And rounded, of course, so like a nice hover state. We'll make these blocks so they expand the full width of the drop down. Give them some slight margin. And we'll just say item. So I'm going to just duplicate this a few times. Maybe, yeah, 3 for now. And that's going to be essentially it. We'll need to ensure that when we click the button, we need to actually toggle the active state. So Vue has these directives built in that listen for event listeners in JavaScript. So I would always, it's kind of muscle memory, but .prevent essentially does the event.prevent default in JavaScript, and that just means whatever the button's actually going to do, it just cancels out. In this case, the button isn't within a form or anything, so it wouldn't do anything at all, but it's a nice habit to have, I think. And since we want to toggle, you don't want to just set it to false or true here, because it'll only just set it to that. So in this case, you can just do the inverse of active. So it's every time you click, it'll close or open or close, if that makes sense. And I think we should be all set here. So let's double check. We can see some stuff. Looks like we got some errors. PostCSS not found. Did you install it? Oh, I don't need this. So it's thinking I need to install Sass. So let's refresh. Here's our drop-down button. Notice it did the little animation there. That's part of that class binding. When we click, it sets active. When we click again, it doesn't. So it's pretty sweet. I don't get why Vue isn't detected here, but that's interesting. Might be part of Vue 3. But there you go. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover. All the button various states, how I author components in Tailwind when it comes to buttons. The theme here, of course, is open to opinions and changing. Feel free to go wild. But this is what I would do commonly on a larger scale app, is kind of just, before I even think about actually designing pages per se, I'll create a design system first. And this is kind of how that works. So hopefully that's useful. Again, look for more of this series to come. I'm going to probably try to cover as many components, ideas as I can think of. If you have any ideas, let me know. And they can be interactive, they can be static, whatever, like a slider. I don't know, are sliders even a thing anymore? Maybe, but we could add that, or a carousel. But yeah, so look for more to come. Hopefully this wasn't too long-winded. I know it's almost an hour at this point, so if it's useful, let me know. I can cut these down to smaller videos too and just do less, and hopefully still get the point across. All right, guys, peace.